In this lesson, we will consider the events of the First World War. Later on, this will help us when we are trying to decide whether the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh on Germany or not. So, in the beginning of the war, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The Russians then began to mobilize their vast army, trying to get their soldiers ready and move them to the front line. Germany then enacted its Schlieffen Plan, sending an army through Belgium with the aim of knocking France out of the war early and then returning to deal with Russia. This brought Britain into the war against Germany. The Russians surprised Germany, however, by managing to mobilize their army faster than the Germans had thought them capable of, and so the Germans were actually left with a two-front war which they had hoped to avoid. They were fighting France in the west and Russia in the east. Let's have a look first at the Western Front and the situation of stalemate which soon followed the German invasion. The Germans did manage to successfully sweep through Belgium and towards Paris, but they never got there. They were stopped by French armies at the Battle of the Marne outside Paris, and what followed was 3 years of bloody stalemate and trench warfare. Typical tactics during this period were that one side would attempt to soften up the enemy before an attack with a massive artillery bombardment. The troops in the enemy trenches, however, would simply retreat down into their dugouts, and so consequently, when the infantry of the first side attempted to move into and take over the trenches of the enemy, they would simply come out of their dugouts, and any advancing troops would be met with a murderous hailstorm of machine gun fire, rifle fire and artillery. So even if they did manage to take a section of trench, very often they couldn't hold it and simply had to retreat back to their own lines. This picture, for me, really helps to bring to mind the absolute horror of poison gas, one of the most awful weapons of the First World War, the stark imagery of the skeletal mask upon the soldier, and the strange and haunting image of the dogs also clad in gas masks. The USA joined the war in 1917, but why? Well, Britain was actually buying a lot of supplies from the Americans which were crossing the Atlantic Ocean, often in American-owned and run ships, supplies such as food, hardware and military supplies. The German fleet was blockaded inside German harbours by the Royal Navy, so they started to use submarines or U-boats. U-boat is the German word for submarine, to sink this shipping and try and prevent Britain from being supplied, to try and starve Britain into surrender. Well, the Americans clearly were not happy about all of their ships, or many of their ships rather, being sunk by German submarines. And the final thing which really brought America into the war was something known as the Zimmermann telegram. A secret message sent to the German embassy in Mexico, which basically intended to try and persuade Germany, not Germany, to try and persuade Mexico to attack the United States. And the fact of the boats being sunk, combined with the German effort to try and get Mexico to attack the USA, brought America into the war in 1917. Let's now consider the Eastern Front, and a very significant event for the 20th century, which was the Russian Revolution. On the Eastern Front, the Germans were actually winning. There wasn't a situation of stalemate. The Russians had lost vast areas of land and lost huge battles, such as at Tannenberg. The German High Command also had something of a secret weapon. They sent Lenin to Russia on a secret train, hoping that his ideas of communism, his Bolshevik ideas of communism, would help to bring down the Russian government. Well, they were very successful in this. Lenin, in the October Revolution of 1917, overthrew the German government of the time and took Russia out of the war. So the Germans had effectively won in the east. They also gained huge areas of land, Lenin signed a treaty at the place called Brest-Litovsk, in which the Germans gained huge amounts of land from Russia, a very harsh treaty where the Germans, as I say, took huge amounts of land from the Russians. In the West, there was a last big German offensive in 1917 and 1918. The Germans took the troops from the east, where they'd already won, and added them to their troops in the west in a last big push, a last big effort to try and defeat the Allies in the west, before the Americans arrive in significant numbers. The naval blockade of the Royal Navy is really starting to have an effect in Germany now, though. There are food shortages and riots, there are workers rioting, and there are mutinies. It's really looking quite hopeless for Germany. The last German offensive failed. American troops were starting to now arrive in larger numbers, so there was a numerical advantage for the Allies. The Germans had been fighting for 4 long years, they were exhausted, and the US troops were fresh, combined with the British, the French troops, the Canadian troops, and so on. It was a real advantage to have these new troops arriving. And this, combined with effective use of the new military weapon, the tank, speeded up the obvious looming defeat of the German army, together with the naval blockade. Also, earlier on, a speech by Wilson had perhaps encouraged some people in the German command to hope that Wilson's idea of 14 points, which sounded very fair, Wilson's idea of 14 points would help to shape the future peace. This then encouraged the Germans to sign the Armistice, or an agreement to stop fighting. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was formally signed and Germany surrendered, thus bringing the First World War to an end.